There's a moment when you realize the people you love are just users. My name is Hailey Jensen. I was standing in my kitchen in the house I paid for when I overheard my mother say it. She owes us this. It's the least she can do. For a decade, I was the silent, invisible benefactor. I paid the mortgage, the bills, their debts. And in their eyes, I was the selfish one for wanting a life of my own. They had no idea I'd kept every single receipt. And they certainly had no idea how one single ironclad clause I'd buried in a legal document years ago could bring their entire entitled world crashing down. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The cheap Merlot I'd bought sloshed near the rim of the glass as my brother Leo held it up. "To Hailey," he announced, his voice just a little too loud, a little too slurred. 28. Man, you're getting old. Next thing you know, you'll be, well, you know. He let out a sharp laugh, and my mother Karen chimed in from the head of the table. "Oh, Leo, stop it. She's still our girl." It wasn't a defense. It was a cue. I forced a smile, the muscles in my face aching. This was my birthday dinner. This was my house. The heavy oak table, the brushed nickel chandelier, the very roast cooling on the plates. I had paid for all of it. And yet, sitting here, I felt less like the owner and more like a high-strung caterer who hadn't been tipped. Across the table, my boyfriend Mark met my eyes. His gaze was a lifeline in the suffocating theater of my family. He saw it. He saw the passive-aggressive jabs, the entitlement dressed up as family affection. He reached under the table, his hand finding mine, his warm, steady grip the only real thing in the room. He'd brought a beautiful leather-bound sketchbook for my UX design work. Leo, of course, had brought nothing. He had, however, arrived 20 minutes late, bursting in with a gust of cold air and an immediate complaint. "It's making that clunking sound again." "Hales," he'd announced, tossing his keys on the entryway table I'd refinished. "The car, you've got to get it looked at. I can't be driving around in a death trap." My car, I thought. The one I co-signed for, the one whose insurance and registration I paid because Leo at 24 was still finding himself. "We'll look at it tomorrow, Leo." I'd said, the automated response sliding out before I could even think. It's just one thing after another. Karen sighed, dabbing at the corners of her mouth with a napkin. She was a woman who had mastered the art of the fragile sigh, turning it into a weapon of mass guilt. I just don't know how we manage. We. The word hung in the air. She looked at me, her eyes so good at appearing watery, fixed on my face. "It must be so nice to have your fancy career, Hailey, just sitting at a computer all day. I never had that luxury, you know. After your father..." She let the sentence hang unfinished, as she had for 10 years. It was her favorite ghost, the one she could summon at will to end any argument. Mark shifted, his jaw tightening. He was a civil engineer. He understood foundations, and he knew mine was rotten. "Hailey works incredibly hard, Karen," he said, his voice level. Karen's smile was instant and brittle. "Oh, of course she does, dear. We're all so proud." She then turned her attention to the expensive bottle of single malt whiskey Mark had placed on the sideboard. "My goodness," she said. "Look at that. We're just a simple family, Mark. We're not used to such lavish things. I just hope you understand what family first really means to people like us." The message was clear. You are the outsider. You are the poison. You are trying to take her from us. "Speaking of," Karen said, her voice brightening with a terrifying manufactured cheer, "we have something for you, Hailey. Leo, fetch her gift." Leo dutifully retrieved a flat, poorly wrapped package. I carefully peeled back the tape. It was a cheap black plastic frame from a discount store. Inside, a faded photo of my father smiling on a fishing trip, his face pixelated from being blown up too large. "Oh," I said. It was the only word I could manage. "And the card," Karen prompted, as if I might miss it. I slid the card from its envelope. Her familiar looping script filled the space. "To our dearest Hailey." I read aloud, my voice feeling thin and distant. Your father always knew you'd be the one to hold us all together. Don't ever forget that. I stared at the words. It wasn't a birthday wish. It was an invoice. It was a threat. Don't ever forget that. I looked from the card to the photo of the father. I barely remembered a man they now used as a shield, as the emotional justification for my servitude. Mark's hand tightened on mine, his knuckles white. He knew exactly what that card meant. The room suddenly felt hot, the smell of the pot roast and the Merlot becoming oppressive. Hold us all together. My mind plunged back 10 years to the smell of hospital disinfectant and my mother's wailing. I was 18, barely an adult, and she had collapsed into my arms, a whisper-thin woman who suddenly felt immensely heavy. I can't do this alone, Hailey. She'd wept, her nails digging into my skin. You're the strong one. You have to take care of us. Promise me. Promise your father. And I did. I was a stupid, grieving kid, and I made the only promise I could. I'll take care of you, Mom. I promise. I hadn't realized I was signing a blank check for the rest of my life. I'd honored that promise. I'd honored it when I gave up my scholarship to an out-of-state university to stay here to go to the local community college so I could work. I'd honored it when I got my UX design job, and at 23 bought this house, this beautiful, suffocating house to get them out of their overmortgaged rental. I put it in my name, a single stupid moment of self-preservation, but I let them live in it as if it were theirs. I honored it every month when my paycheck vanished, siphoned off to the mortgage, the utilities, the premium family health plan I'd put Karen on, and the household account that was supposed to be for groceries, but somehow always covered Leo's bar tabs and Karen's QVC binges. I'd honored it when I paid Leo's tuition, watching him party his way through a communications degree while I coded until 3 a.m. to meet my own deadlines. I'd honored it 6 months ago when I quietly paid off Karen's $10,000 credit card debt accumulated from forgetting she was a widow and not a millionaire. All of it in silence. All of it while they told me I had it so easy. All of it while they treated me less like a daughter and more like an unfeeling automated ATM. I blinked, the flashback receding. It's lovely, Mom. Thank you. I folded the card and placed it beside the grotesque frame. The tension was so thick I could barely breathe. I'll get the coffee, I muttered, standing up abruptly. I needed to escape, if only for a minute. I walked into the kitchen, my back to the doorway, and gripped the edge of the cool granite countertop, my knuckles turning white. I just needed to breathe. I heard Karen's chair scrape back, but she didn't come into the kitchen. She must have paused in the hallway, thinking I'd gone upstairs or to the bathroom. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. She was on the phone. I know Carol, she was saying. My Aunt Carol, the family gossip. The fake frailty in Karen's voice was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resentment I rarely heard. No, he's still here, the boyfriend. Mark. She paused, listening. He's just always around now. He's putting all these ideas in her head about moving about, money. I just don't know what we're going to do if she, well, you know. Another pause. I held my breath, the granite biting into my palms. She's getting selfish. That's what it is. She just doesn't get it. My blood went cold. I couldn't move. She acts like this is all hers. Karen spat, her voice dripping with a venom I'd never heard. All this. She owes us this. It's the least she can do. The pre-approval letter felt electric in my hands. Mark was driving, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, not from tension but from pure, unadulterated excitement. We'd just come from the bank. It's enough, he said, his voice cracking with a grin. It's enough for the down payment and the escrow. We were parked on the side of a quiet, tree-lined street, staring at our future. It was a small, brick-and-siding fixer-upper 2 hours away from the suffocating orbit of my family. It had a sagging porch and a yard full of weeds, but it was ours. Or it could be. The house was a tangible thing, a physical manifestation of the boundary I so desperately needed to build. It was a future where my paycheck went toward my own life, not just the maintenance of theirs. Our own project, Mark murmured, squeezing my hand. He knew. He knew this wasn't just about a house. It was about an escape. The joy lasted for the entire 2-hour drive, back a fragile bubble that I knew was about to burst. By the time we pulled into the driveway of my house, the one Karen and Leo called home, the dread was a cold stone in my stomach. I had to do this. For me, for Mark, for any chance at a life that wasn't just a long, slow bleed. I'd rehearsed it in my head 100 times. I wouldn't be angry. I wouldn't be accusatory. I would be gentle, respectful, and firm. I wasn't cutting them off, I'd say just scaling back. I loved them, but I had to start building my own life. It sounded so reasonable in my head, so adult. I was a fool to think reason had any place here. I found them in the living room, bathed in the blue light of the 70-inch television I'd bought last Christmas. Leo was sprawled on the recliner I'd paid for, and Karen was curled on the sofa I'd also paid for. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding weak. "Can we talk? We have some news." The TV clicked off. Their faces, expectant and slightly annoyed at the interruption, turned to me. Mark stood beside me, a silent pillar of support. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack one. "Mark and we're taking a big step." I began, my palms sweating. "We found a house we love. It's in Chesterton. We've been pre-approved for a mortgage." Leo's head snapped up. "Chesterton? That's like 2 hours away." "I know," I said, trying to keep my voice gentle. "It's a fixer-upper, but it's exactly what we've been looking for, and it means things are going to have to change a bit here." I looked at my mother. "I'll always love you, and I'll always help however I can. But I can't keep paying for everything. The mortgage on this house, the utilities, Leo's car. I can't do it all anymore and build a future for myself. I'm not cutting you off. I'm just scaling back." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy, cold, and predatory. Karen didn't move. Leo was the first to break it, his voice a low, incredulous scoff. "You're kidding me, right?" He stood up, pacing the floor. "Scale back? What the hell does that mean? So that's it? You're just going to leave us high and dry, all because your boyfriend wants a new project?" He jabbed a finger toward Mark, his eyes flashing with a sudden, ugly rage. "This is his idea, isn't it?" Before Mark could even speak, Karen raised a hand and the room fell silent again. She looked at me not with the anger of a woman betrayed, but with the practiced, devastating sorrow of a martyr. Her lower lip began to tremble. "Hailey," she whispered, and the sound of my name on her lips felt like a razor. After everything we have been through, I never thought I would see the day my own daughter would choose a man over her own blood." The accusation landed, sucking the air from my lungs. "Mom, that's not what this is, isn't it?" Her voice rose, gaining that familiar quavering strength. "He's barely been in your life 2 years and you're ready to throw your family away. We've been here. We've supported you." The irony of that statement was so profound it was almost comical. "This is incredibly selfish, Hailey. Just selfish. What would your father think?" And there it was. The nuclear option, the emotional bomb she detonated every time I dared to have a boundary. She brought my dead father into the room and sat him in judgment of me. "That's not fair, Karen," Mark said, his voice low and tight. He stepped forward, putting himself between us. "She's not abandoning anyone. She's not being selfish. She's 28 years old, and she's trying to live her own life, a life she deserves." Karen recoiled as if he had slapped her. Her sorrow evaporated, replaced by a white-hot fury that was all the more terrifying for its speed. Her eyes, cold and reptilian, locked on him. "You," she hissed. "This is you. You've been poisoning her, whispering in her ear, trying to steal my daughter from me. You think I don't see what you are, a poisonous influence. You come in here with your plans and your future, and try to make her forget who she is, who her family is. You're trying to make her betray her father's memory." The words echoed in the sudden terrible silence. Betray her father's memory. It was no longer a discussion. It was an indictment. They hadn't just said no, they had declared war. They had taken my desire for a life and twisted it into an act of treachery. They had framed me as a villain and Mark as the snake in our garden. I looked at my mother's face contorted with a rage that felt ancient, and my brother's smug and righteous. The battle line wasn't just drawn, it was carved in stone, and I was on the wrong side of it. I drove back to my apartment in a state of shock, so profound it felt like a dream. The world outside the car windows seemed muted, the colors bled out. Mark didn't speak, didn't press, just drove his presence a silent, solid anchor in the storm of my mother's final shrieking accusation. You're trying to make her betray her father's memory. The words didn't just echo, they had become a permanent part of the ringing in my ears. I felt hollowed out as if they had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything soft, leaving only a brittle, aching shell. For days, I moved through my life like a ghost. I went to work, I coded, I attended meetings. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. But inside, I was numb adrift in a cold sea of betrayal. Mark was my lighthouse. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't tell me what to do. He just made sure I ate. He'd show up with takeout, put on a mindless movie, and sit beside me on the couch, his shoulder pressed against mine, a quiet testament that I wasn't alone. One night, as I stared blankly at the television screen, he took my hand. "Whatever you decide to do, Hailey," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Even if it's nothing, I'm with you. But this has to be your choice. Not mine, not theirs, yours." His words were a small key turning a lock I didn't even know was rusted shut. My choice. For 10 years, there had been no choice. There had only been obligation, the promise. That night, I couldn't sleep. The numbness was finally receding, replaced by something else, something hot and sharp. It was a fury so pure it felt like a revelation. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Mark, and went into my small home office. The city lights glittered outside my window, a million separate lives that had nothing to do with me or my suffocating family drama. I sat down and opened my laptop. The soft glow of the screen illuminated my face. I navigated to my bank's website, my fingers moving with a strange new certainty. I logged in. And there it was. The architecture of my own prison, laid out in neat, orderly rows. The list of scheduled automatic payments was a monument to my silence. Mortgage $2,850, utilities $450, Geico Leo Jensen $220. It went on and on, a quiet monthly hemorrhage. Each line item was a shackle I had willingly fastened myself. For years, I avoided looking too closely at this page. It was too painful, too overwhelming. But now I scrolled through it with a surgeon's cold precision. My cursor hovered over the mortgage payment. Too much, too soon, a voice in my head cautioned. That's the nuclear option. Then it drifted down the list, past the car insurance, past the property tax savings transfer. It stopped on one line in particular. Comcast Ultimate Bundle, $289.99, $290 a month. For premium cable, every movie channel imaginable, and the fastest fiber optic internet available in their area. A sudden, vivid memory flared in my mind. It was from 6 months ago. I'd come home to their home after a brutal 14-hour workday, my eyes burning from staring at code. The house was dark except for the flickering light from Leo's room. I'd knocked gently. "You can't come in," he'd shouted over the sound of digital gunfire. "I'm in a raid." Through the door, I'd heard him laughing with his online friends. "Nah, that's just my sister," he'd said, his voice dripping with casual disdain. "She's the one who pays the bills, so I guess we have to let her live here." Another memory surfaced just as sharp. My mother sitting on the sofa flipping through channels on the massive television I'd bought her for her birthday. "There's just nothing to watch." She'd sighed dramatically, surrounded by a mountain of packages from a home shopping channel. I'm so bored and lonely all day. All that access, all that entertainment, all of it funded by my exhaustion. And it was still never enough. It wasn't a utility. It wasn't a necessity. It was a luxury. A luxury they had come to see as their birthright. My cursor hovered over the cancel payment button. My heart was a steady, rhythmic drum. This wasn't about the money. This was about the message. This was a correction. An act of rebellion so quiet they wouldn't even hear it until the signal went dead. I thought of my father, the man they used as a cudgel to beat me with. I thought of his last journal entry, the one I hadn't found yet, but whose sentiment I felt in my bones. He wouldn't have wanted this. He wouldn't have wanted me to break myself on the altar of their comfort. I clicked the button. A small box popped up. Are you sure you want to cancel this scheduled payment? I clicked confirm. The line item on the screen turned gray, then vanished. A tiny, invisible act of rebellion in the dead of night, but it felt monumental. It felt like the first stone being pulled from a wall that was about to come tumbling down. I didn't feel cruel. I felt a cold, clean sense of accuracy. I closed the laptop, went back to bed, and for the first time in days, I slept. The next afternoon, my phone buzzed on my desk at work. A text message. I looked down and saw Leo's name. My breath caught in my throat. I opened it. The message read, WTF. The internet is out. Mom says you need to fix it. I have a paper to write. I stared at the words. You need to fix it. Not a question. Not a request. A command. The immediate unthinking assumption that I was not his sister, but his service provider. That this was my responsibility to solve my problem to handle. A wave of cold fury, clean and clarifying, washed through me. My hands were perfectly steady as I typed my reply. The bill is in your name now. You'll have to call them. My phone screen lit up with the word Mom not 10 seconds after I sent the text to Leo. I let it ring, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. It went to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. And again. Then Leo started. The barrage of calls and texts was so immediate, so violent, it was like I had kicked a hornet's nest. I put my phone on silent and stared at it as the screen flashed a beacon of their collective rage. I felt a small, dark thrill of power immediately followed by a wave of crushing guilt. This is what they've trained you to feel, a small, cold voice in my head whispered. Guilt is the leash. I forced myself to get back to work, my focus shattered. When I got home, Mark was there, a worried look on his face. Your phone's been buzzing off the hook, he said, handing it to me. I didn't answer. I had 23 missed calls, 16 from Karen, 7 from Leo, and a new voicemail. I pressed play, putting it on speaker. Karen's voice filled the quiet apartment, but it wasn't the furious hiss I'd expected. It was the other one, the broken one, the weeping, gasping for air victim. Hailey, how could you do this? She sobbed, a performance of Oscar-worthy despair. To punish us like this, us, your family. We have nothing. I don't know what we did to deserve this cruelty. The message ended in a ragged gasp. I felt Mark's eyes on me. I stood firm, my hands clenched at my sides, but my stomach was churning. The practiced, manipulative sorrow was almost harder to resist than her anger. She's punishing me, I whispered, the realization dawning. She's punishing me for the house by making me the villain. You didn't do this, Hailey, Mark said, his voice a low, steady anchor. You just stopped doing something you never should have had to do in the first place. But the real attack, the one that blindsided me, wasn't the direct assault. It was the flanking maneuver. That started 2 days later. The weapon of choice wasn't a phone call. It was my Aunt Carol. Carol, my mother's sister, the town's self-appointed historian and moral arbiter who thrived on the dramas of others. The smear campaign began, and it was devastatingly effective. Our town wasn't big. It was the kind of place where everyone knew your parents and your reputation was a fragile public thing. I was Hailey Jensen, the girl who'd done good. The smart, quiet one who got a great job after her father passed, God rest his soul. The one who held it all together. In the span of about 48 hours, that narrative was systematically brutally rewritten. The news story spread through hushed phone calls, concerned whispers over coffee shop counters, and sorrowful discussions at church. Was this Hailey corrupted by her new big city boyfriend, and her high-paying job had turned cold? She was abandoning her poor widowed mother. She was ungrateful. She was selfish. She was in the most salacious whispered version trying to kick her family out on the street so she could sell the house for a profit and run off with that man. I didn't know the specifics, not at first. I just felt the chill. I felt it when I stopped at the bank and the teller, a woman I'd gone to high school with, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. I felt it when an old neighbor saw me in the grocery store and abruptly turned her cart down another aisle. The air around me had changed. I was no longer a person. I was a scandal. The public humiliation, the moment that burned itself into my memory, happened at the post office. I was in line to mail a package for work. Mrs. Davies, my old Sunday school teacher and my mother's closest friend, was in front of me. She turned, saw me, and her face, usually so warm, froze. She gave me a look of such profound, pitying disappointment that I felt my face flush hot. "Hailey," she said, her voice low enough for only us and the 3 people behind me to hear. "I am just so very sorry." I was confused. "Sorry for what, Mrs. Davies?" Her eyes welled with what looked like genuine tears. She reached out and patted my arm, a gesture that felt like a public shaming. "I'm praying for you, dear," she said, her voice thick with meaning. "I'm praying for your soul, and for your dear sweet mother, of course. What that woman has had to endure." She shook her head, a tragic gesture, then turned back to the counter, leaving me standing there, branded, my shame visible for everyone to see. I fled the post office, the package forgotten, my heart pounding with a suffocating, unjust rage. The injustice was the worst part. It was a lie, a pervasive, poisonous fog, and I had no way to fight it. How could I stop it? By taking out an ad in the local paper. "Dear Town. My family has been financially bleeding me dry for a decade, and I'm finally saying no." They were fighting for their allowance for their comfortable, subsidized lives, and they had zero qualms about destroying my character to protect it. I finally truly understood. This wasn't just about money, it was about my identity. It was about narrative control, and they were winning. When I got back to my apartment, I sat in my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe. I felt utterly, completely alone, isolated by a web of lies I couldn't untangle. I sat there for a long time until the anger cooled into that familiar diamond-hard resolve. This was what they did. This was who they were. They would burn me to the ground to stay warm. I finally went inside. The mail was piled on the small table by the door. Bill's junk, and a single thick cream-colored envelope. It wasn't junk. My name and address were typed formal and cold. In the top left corner was a return address that made my stomach plummet. It wasn't from my family. It was from a law firm, Gable, Finch and Associates. My breath caught. Tucked in the corner were the words, "Certified Mail." This was no longer just whispers. This was no longer just gossip. They had escalated. My hands were not shaking. That's what I remember most. As I stood in the hallway of my apartment staring at the thick, cream-colored envelope from Gable, Finch and Associates, I felt a strange, cold calm. The certified mail receipt was stapled to the front, a bureaucratic stamp on an act of war. I didn't use a letter opener. I tore the envelope open with my thumb, a ragged, violent motion. The paper inside was heavy, expensive. It felt important. It felt final. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs, the whereas and heretofore, and in the matter of. The legalese was a thick fog, But the words, when they finally swam into focus, were as sharp and clear as broken glass. Karen Jensen versus Hailey Jensen. My mother. My own mother was suing me. I read it again, the words not quite making sense. It was a formal legal petition, a request for an emergency hearing, a petition to have the deed to the house on Maple Drive, my house, transferred to her name. I stumbled back, my hand grabbing the wall for balance. My stomach heaved, a sour hot bile rising in my throat. The petition claimed a breach of verbal contract. It claimed long-term established dependency. It argued that I, her daughter, had, through repeated actions and verbal assurances, made it clear that the house was in spirit and intent hers. That my name on the deed was a mere formality, a convenience I had used to secure a favorable mortgage rate, and that the property was by all moral rights her own. But the lies, the bold, spectacular cruelty of the lies, were what truly stole my breath. The petition, a sworn affidavit signed by my mother, painted me as emotionally unstable. It claimed I was prone to rash and coercive financial actions and under the undue influence of a third party, which was a cold legal way of naming Mark. It described my decision to cancel the cable and internet as a targeted act of financial abuse, part of a disturbing and erratic pattern of behavior. They weren't just trying to take the house. They were trying to take my name. They were trying to build a legal case that I was not only cruel, but mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. They were trying to have me declared incompetent so they could take everything. A wave of dizzying, suffocating panic washed over me. I could feel the floor tilting. This was how they won. They would drag me into court, bleed me dry with lawyers, and parade my selfishness in front of a judge, all while Mrs. Davies and the rest of the town clucked in the pews, praying for my mother's soul. I was going to lose everything. But then, just as quickly as the panic had risen, it receded. It was sucked back out to sea by a cold, powerful, and utterly unfamiliar tide. What was left behind wasn't fear. It was a chilling, diamond-hard resolve that settled deep in my bones. It was the ice-cold clarity of a person who has finally been pushed too far. They had put their betrayal in writing. They had signed it. My feet moved, though I don't remember telling them to. I walked past my desk, past my bed, and into my closet. In the back, on the floor, beneath a pile of old running shoes, was a small black fireproof safe. My fingers, now perfectly steady, punched in the 4-digit code. The lock clicked open. I didn't reach for my passport. I reached for a thick black 3-ring binder. Its plastic cover was slightly dusty. The label, printed from a label maker 5 years ago, read 415 Maple Drive, closing. I had been 23 years old when I bought that house. I had just landed my first good design job. My father's life insurance policy had been a pittance, barely enough to cover a 10% down payment on a small suburban house. But it was his. And I had been determined to use it for something permanent, something to anchor us after he was gone. Even then, though a small, wary part of me had known, some instinct for self-preservation, a quiet voice that hadn't yet been completely silenced, had warned me. I hadn't used the real estate lawyer my mother's friends recommended. I'd found my own. A man named Arthur Dunn, a sharp, cynical, suspender-wearing lawyer whose eyes seemed to have seen every possible way a family could tear itself apart. "So you're buying a house?" he'd said, staring at me over his glasses. "No," I'd corrected, a good, obedient daughter. "I'm buying a house for my mother and brother to live in." "No, you're not," he'd snapped back, his voice gruff. "You're buying an investment property that you are generously allowing your family to inhabit as tenants. And we will be documenting it as such." I flipped through the binder, now my fingers knowing exactly where to go. Past the title insurance, past the mortgage agreement, past the inspection report. Tucked near the very back was a 2-page addendum printed on a different colored paper. It was titled, "Revocable Deed on Demand and Tenancy at Will Agreement." Arthur had insisted on it. "This is your non-negotiable, kid," he'd said, tapping the paper. This protects you from them, and it protects you from yourself. The language was bulletproof. It explicitly stated that Karen Jensen and Leo Jensen were tenants at will, their residency contingent on my sole and absolute discretion. It outlined that their tenancy was not and would never be considered an equity stake or a verbal contract. And then there it was, the clause. The one Arthur had called the hand grenade in the desk drawer. It stated in clear, unambiguous terms that if any legal action whatsoever, any petition, any suit, any challenge was filed by the tenants contesting my sole ownership, their right to residency was immediately and automatically terminated. It triggered by their own signature a 30-day notice to vacate. Non-negotiable, non-reversible. I remembered the day of the closing sitting in that sterile conference room. I'd slid that paper across the table. Just some extra lawyer jargon? I'd mumbled, already trained to minimize my own self-preservation. We just have to sign it for the bank. They hadn't even read it. Karen had been busy talking to the realtor about what color to paint the living room, and Leo was texting. They had scribbled their signatures, impatient, dismissing the very document that held their future in its ink. I stared at their signatures now. Karen Jensen, Leo Jensen, a legally binding suicide pact. They had no idea what they had just done. They had just walked confidently and arrogantly directly into the one trap I had set not for them, but for myself. The panic, the rage, the fear, it all evaporated. I was left with a stillness so profound, it felt like the eye of a hurricane. I pulled my phone from my pocket. My thumb was steady as I scrolled through my contacts and found Arthur Dunn. I pressed call. He picked up on the second ring, his voice the same gruff bark. Dunn. Arthur, it's Hailey Jensen, I said. My voice was calm. It was clear. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 5 years, but it was a voice that was finally completely devoid of emotion. They did it. They actually did it. Let's set a meeting. We chose the Mediation Center on Oak Street. It was a place where people went to dissolve things, marriages, business partnerships. It felt appropriate. The conference room was a monument to neutrality, designed to have no personality, no memory. The walls were a pale, sickly beige. The carpet was a low industrial gray, and the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. The only sound was the hollow hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, bathing everything in a flat, unforgiving glow. My lawyer, Arthur Dunn, arrived first, just as I did. He was an old-world warrior, his ancient leather briefcase resting on the table like a sleeping guard dog. He didn't speak, just nodded at me, his eyes clear and sharp over his glasses. We sat in silence, 2 statues waiting for the play to begin. They arrived 10 minutes late, a deliberate power move. They didn't walk in as a family. They walked in as a prosecution team. Aunt Carol led the way, her face set in a mask of righteous fury, her purse clutched like a weapon. My mother, Karen, followed, her eyes already watery, a fragile, suffering dove in a gray cardigan. Leo trailed behind them, his gaze sullen, looking like a teenager dragged to church. And then came their lawyer, a man named Gable, all pinstripes and smug sincerity. He radiated an oily confidence, the kind of man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice. Ms. Jensen, Gable said, nodding to me with a pitying smile, pointedly ignoring Arthur. And Mr. Dunn. Good of you to come. They arranged themselves on the opposite side of the long faux wood table, a chasm. Let's dispense with the pleasantries, shall we? Arthur said, his voice a low growl. You filed a petition based on fabrication. We are here to respond. Gable held up a placating hand. Now, Arthur, let's not be adversarial. We are here to talk about a family, about an obligation. He turned his full patronizing attention to me. Hailey, he said, and the use of my first name was a calculated intimacy. My client, your mother, is not a vindictive woman. She is a grieving woman, a mother who finds herself in her twilight years, facing the unimaginable, being cast out by her own child. I said nothing. I just watched him. I focused on a small circular watermark on the table, a ghost of some previous spilled coffee. I made my face a blank neutral mask. She is not asking for the world. Gable continued, his voice adopting a sonorous, preachy tone. She is simply asking for what is morally hers, what was promised to her. She is asking for the home her late husband, God rest his soul, intended for her. She is asking, he leaned forward, for you to honor the bond that is, and always should be stronger than any piece of paper. He smiled, as if he had just said something profound. We are not in a courtroom, Hailey. We are in a room of conscience, and the conscience of this matter, the morality of it, is entirely on your side, or rather, on ours. Aunt Carol sniffed a perfect-timed sound of agreement. Karen produced a single heroic tear. Gable sat back, folding his hands over his legal pad, the picture of reasonable authority. Frankly, he said, his tone shifting to one of mild disappointment, your recent actions, they speak of a coldness. A turning away. It's Shakespearean in a way. The ingratitude of the child. Like King Lear, your mother finds herself. Are you quite finished? Arthur's voice cut through the performance like a rusty saw. Gable blinked, startled. Arthur hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. He reached into his ancient briefcase and pulled out a single laminated document. He slid it across the table. It made a crisp shh sound on the faux wood grain, coming to a stop directly in front of Gable. Gable looked at it, then at Arthur, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He picked it up. And what is this? That, Arthur said, is your client's signature on a document you clearly failed to ask them about. I watched Gable read. It was a beautiful, terrible thing to behold. He started with an amused, dismissive air. Then his brow furrowed. He scanned down the page, his finger tracing the lines. I saw his jaw clench. I saw the blood physically drain from his face, leaving his skin a pale, waxy color. He looked up, his eyes wide, no longer full of pity, but of sudden, stark panic. He looked at Karen. Is this your signature? He whispered, his voice cracking. I don't remember, Karen stammered. Is it? Gable hissed, shoving the paper toward her. We signed a lot of papers, Aunt Carol interjected. The bank. This isn't a bank document, Gable snapped. He looked back at Arthur, his professional mask shattered. This is entrapment. It's unconscionable. It's a contract, Arthur said, his voice flat. One my client insisted on and one your client signed of their own free will. Before Gable could formulate a response, before my mother could orchestrate another sob, I placed my own item on the table. It was a 3-inch spiral-bound report, thick and heavy, with a clear plastic cover. I didn't slide it. I placed it. The sound it made, a dull, heavy thud, seemed to suck all the air from the room. Karen flinched. Leo, who had been staring at his phone, finally looked up, his eyes widening at the sheer size of the binder. My mother is suing me for what she is morally owed, I said. My voice was low, but it didn't tremble. It was a voice I didn't recognize, clear and cold as ice. So I did the math. This, I tapped the cover, is what you're owed. Gable reached for it, but I pushed it past his hand toward the center of the table, toward them. Open it, I said. Leo, his curiosity piqued, was the one who pulled it closer. He opened the cover. The first page was a summary, a single astronomical number at the bottom, the grand total. He just stared at it. That's a lie, Karen shrieked, her eyes wild. That's impossible. It's all in there. I said, my voice as calm as the hum of the lights above us. 10 years. Every mortgage payment, every property tax bill, the $48,000 roof replacement in 2022, the new furnace in 2023, every gas, electric, and water bill, every car I co-signed for, every insurance premium, every tuition payment, every loan for a small emergency that was never ever paid back. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table. It's all in there, with copies of the bank statements, the canceled checks, and the credit card receipts, the ones I kept, the ones you thought I'd forget. Leo was frantically flipping through the pages, his face growing paler. The binder was color-coded, a green tab for the mortgage, a blue tab for utilities, a red tab for Karen, discretionary debt, a yellow tab for Leo, education, and auto. He stopped on a page in the yellow section, his finger landing on a line item. My semester abroad, he whispered, his voice incredulous. You paid $12,000 for my semester abroad. Mom told me I got the full scholarship. He looked up, his eyes for the first time full of a dawning, horrified comprehension, not at me, but at our mother. You said you handled the paperwork, he accused her. Karen's face, which had been pale, was now a deep mottled red. The mask of the fragile martyr was gone, incinerated. What was left was pure, unadulterated rage. She slapped the table, her hand making a sound like a gunshot in the small, quiet room. This is a trick, she screamed, lunging forward. You can't do this. You're lying. This is forgery. You've always been a cold, ungrateful. That's enough, Arthur's voice boomed, and for the first time it was loud. It silenced her instantly. I looked past her, rage past Leo's confusion, past Aunt Carol's sputtering, "This is evil." And I looked directly into my mother's eyes, and I finally spoke. You're right, I said quietly. It's not about the money. It never was. I would have given it to you. I did give it to you for 10 years, gladly, because I loved you. I would have kept doing it. All I needed was for you to see me, to see what I was doing and just say thank you. A sob threatened to break my voice, but I crushed it. But you didn't. Instead, you called me selfish for wanting a life. You told the whole town I was abandoning you, and then you sued me. You tried to legally take the one thing I was building for myself. You didn't just want my money, Mom. You wanted my future too. I leaned in closer the last few inches. You aren't just trying to take a house. You're trying to erase me. You're trying to rewrite my entire life so that my only purpose, my only value was in signing the checks for yours. You're trying to make my sacrifices your entitlement. I looked at her and at Leo and at my aunt, and the final, terrible truth fell from my lips. You didn't raise a daughter. You raised an asset, and I'm done being liquidated. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than any noise. It was broken by Arthur clearing his throat. He addressed Gable, who looked like a man who had just seen his entire case, his fee and his reputation go up in flames. Mr. Gable. Arthur said, his voice now calm and clinical. As you can now plainly see, your client's petition has by their own hand triggered Clause 4B of the Revocable Deed Agreement. Their tenancy is terminated effective immediately. They have no legal standing, no moral claim, and no case. My associate, he checked his watch, a deliberate theatrical gesture, is filing the official 30-day eviction notice with the county court as we speak. I'd imagine it will be processed and served within the hour. He stood up, snapping his briefcase shut. You have 30 days. I suggest you advise your clients to start packing. The words 30 days hung in the sterile air like the pull-pin on a grenade. For a second, there was only the sound of the fluorescent lights humming, then the explosion. It wasn't my mother who moved first. It was her rage. The mask of the grieving, fragile widow didn't just slip. It was incinerated, revealing something ancient, reptilian, and full of teeth. Her face, which had been pale with performative woe, went a deep mottled red. No, she whispered, her voice a low, strangled rasp. No, you can't. And then her head snapped toward me, her eyes pinwheeling with a fury so pure it was almost impressive. You! She shrieked, a sound that seemed to tear from the very back of her throat. You ungrateful! You bitch! She lunged across the table. Her hands clawed fingernails aimed at my face. Gable, his face ashen, fumbled and grabbed her arm. Karen, I advise. Karen. But she was gone, lost in the red-hot, blinding fog of her own entitlement. Aunt Carol was on her feet, her trembling finger pointed at me like a divine judgment. This is evil, Hailey. This is what you are. You are evil. God sees. This God will punish you. Leo was the only one who was silent. He was a ghost, his chair pushed back, staring at the spiral-bound report as if it were an open casket. His face was a void. He wasn't on her side. He wasn't on mine. He had simply ceased to exist, a casualty of his own parasitic life. We are finished here. Arthur Dunn's voice cut through the noise, not loud, but with a gravelly weight that made everyone pause. He snapped his ancient briefcase shut. Click, click. The sound was as final as a judge's gavel. He put a firm, grounding hand on my back. Let's go. We stood in unison. We didn't run. We walked. We walked out of that beige room, past the stunned receptionist, and into the hallway, the sound of my mother's screaming and Aunt Carol's, "You won't get away with this," echoing behind us like the cries of the damned. We walked through the lobby and out the glass doors into the cold, gray, beautifully silent air of the parking lot. I was breathing, my lungs aching as if I'd been holding my breath for 10 years. Mark was there leaning against our car, his jaw tight. The second he saw my face, he was moving toward me. But before he could reach me, I heard it. Hailey! It was Leo. He was running, his footsteps slapping on the pavement, his voice cracking with a desperation that was new. Mark stepped in front of me, his body language instantly protective, a wall between me and the last piece of shrapnel from the explosion. I put a hand on his chest. It's okay, I said, though I wasn't sure it was. Leo stopped a few feet away, his chest heaving, his face a mess of snot and tears. This wasn't the smug, entitled boy from the living room. This was a terrified child. Hailey, please! He begged, his voice a reedy whine. She's going crazy in there. She's throwing things. You can't just kick us out. Please! He took a gasping breath. Where will we go? It's Mom. You know how she is. Just talk to her. Fix this. Fix this. The same 2 words from the text message. After everything he had just seen, after the binder, after the lies, after the lawsuit, I was still the designated fixer. The ATM, the service provider. I looked at him, at the little brother I had taught to ride a bike, whose college applications I had practically written for him. The last flickering ember of hope I had for him, the one I didn't even know was still glowing, was about to be extinguished. I asked him one final question. Leo, I said, and my voice was empty, cold, and clinical. In that room, when you saw the binder, when you saw the numbers, when you realized about your semester abroad, did you for 1 second, 1 single second, think what you and Mom were doing to me was wrong? The question hung in the air between us. It was his last chance, and he failed it. He flinched, his eyes darting away to the ground, to the sky, to Mark, anywhere but my face. He ran a shaking hand through his hair. I didn't know about all the money, Hales. I swear, I don't know, he stammered. But she's Mom. She's scared. She's upset. You know how she gets. Can't you just... He didn't get it. He would never get it. He was pleading for me to put out the fire without ever acknowledging that he was one of the people who had helped set it. He had chosen. He wasn't trapped with her, he was her. He was a part of the same monstrous singular entity of us. Goodbye, Leo, I said. I turned, got in the car, and shut the door. The sound was soft but final. Mark walked around, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I didn't look back as we pulled away. I didn't need to see the small, lost figure of my brother standing in the vast gray parking lot, finally fatally on his own. The next 30 days were the longest month of my life. It was a siege. My phone became a weapon used against me, a bomb that detonated every few minutes. The first 48 hours were a constant shrieking barrage. Voicemails from Karen, not crying but spitting pure, unadulterated venom. "You will burn for this. You are nothing. I hope you die alone." Then came the texts, dozens of them at all hours, a stream of consciousness tirade of all the ways I had failed her from my birth onward. Then came the flying monkeys. Aunt Carol, of course, leading the charge, but also cousins I hadn't spoken to in a decade, old family friends, all calling to leave messages of pure biblical condemnation. "How could you? Your mother is sick. She's a widow. You are killing her." The smear campaign in town went nuclear. I was no longer just ungrateful. I was a monster. I was a sociopath. I was mentally unstable and cruel. After 2 days of this, I did the only thing I could. I built a wall. I blocked Karen. I blocked Leo. I blocked Aunt Carol. I systematically blocked every number I didn't recognize that left a hateful message. I created a filter in my email that sent anything from an unknown Jensen relative or anyone on my mother's Christmas card list directly to a trash folder. I changed my voicemail greeting my voice cold and robotic. "This is Hailey Jensen. If this is a personal matter, I am not available. If this is a legal matter pertaining to 415 Maple Drive, please contact my lawyer Arthur Dunn at..." And I gave his office number. Mark became my shield. He took my phone at night and would sit on the couch deleting the messages and blocking the numbers before I could even see them, his jaw set in a line of cold fury. He was my sanity. He made me eat. He held me when I woke up shaking from nightmares where my mother was screaming in my face. "You're just clearing the debris, Hales," he'd say, his voice a low, steady rumble against my back. "This is the ugly part, but you're almost through it. You're holding the line." I stopped going out. I ordered groceries online. I worked from home, my camera off in meetings. I was a prisoner in my own apartment waiting for my own freedom. Then finally day 30 arrived. It was a crisp, cold Tuesday morning. "The locks will be changed at noon," Arthur had said, "but the law requires a sheriff's escort to formally reclaim the property if the tenants are uncooperative. I've arranged for one to meet you there at 9 a.m. We met Deputy Miller in the driveway of 415 Maple Drive. He was a tall, weary-looking man with a kind face who clearly hated this part of his job. "Just a formality, ma'am," he said, his hand resting on his belt. "In my experience, they're usually long gone by this point." The house looked dark, dead. The lawn was overgrown and a fast food bag was blowing across the yard. No cars were in the driveway. Mark held my hand. His was warm. Mine was ice cold. "Let's do this," he said. The deputy walked up the path and knocked 3 loud official raps that echoed in the morning air. "Sheriff's Department occupants of 415 Maple Drive. This is a legal eviction notice." He waited. The only sound was a dog barking 2 streets over. He knocked again, harder. "This is your final notice to vacate the premises." Silence. He turned to me, his brow furrowed. "You have the key, ma'am." I did. My hand was trembling so hard I could barely get the key into the lock I had paid for. The deadbolt slid back with a heavy final thunk. The deputy put his hand on his holster. "I'm going to enter first," he said. He pushed the door open. "Sheriff's Department," he called into the darkness. He stepped in, and I stepped in right behind him with Mark at my back. They were gone. The furniture was gone. The sofa, the recliner, the 70-inch TV, all of it gone. But that wasn't what hit me. It was the smell. a putrid sour milk and rotting garbage smell that punched me in the face and made me gag my hand, flying to my mouth. The deputy cursed a single sharp word. "Oh my God!" Mark whispered, his voice tight with rage. The deputy found the light switch, and the room was illuminated. It was a war zone. It was a violation. They had taken everything of value, but they had left this. They had ripped open every trash bag in the house and scattered the contents across the floor. Greasy pizza boxes, moldy bread, empty liquor bottles, and rotting raw chicken packages were strewn across the carpets I had paid to have installed. In the kitchen, a gallon of milk had been dumped on the hardwood floors, where it had congealed into a foul white slick. Ketchup and mustard were smeared on the walls in grotesque, childish patterns. They hadn't just moved out. They had tried to desecrate the place. They had tried to wound the one thing I had left the house itself. "Check the rest of the house," the deputy said, his voice hard, his professionalism kicking in. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry you have to see this. This is vandalism." Mark, his face a mask of cold fury, took out his phone and started taking pictures documenting everything. "I'm calling Arthur," he said. I didn't speak. I was in a trance. I walked as if floating down the hall, my feet crunching on bits of trash. I passed Leo's old room, also trashed. I passed my mother's room, the same. Then I stood in the doorway of my old childhood bedroom, the one I'd slept in until I was 18. The one they had used as a guest room. The furniture was gone. But they had left one last message. My last personal birthday card. Scrawled across the dresser mirror in a tube of bright, garish, waxy red lipstick, the kind my mother always wore, was a single towering word. Ingrate. I stared at it. I stared at the juvenile, hateful, misspelled word she had used an E instead of an A. I stared at it, and a strange, cold, and terrible thing happened. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the sting of pain. I didn't feel rage. I felt validation. Pure crystalline validation. This one word, this single petty childish act of destruction, was the final, irrefutable proof. It was the period at the end of a 10-year sentence. This was who they were. This was the truth, stripped of all its pretty lies and performative victimhood. This was the receipt for all my pain, signed by them. "Ma'am, you okay?" The deputy called from the hall, his voice gentle. I reached out and touched the waxy red letter. "I'm fine," I said, my voice clear. After the deputy left, after he'd filed his report and given me a card for a trauma scene cleaning crew, after Mark had finished his call with Arthur, I stood in the middle of the trashed living room. I stood there surrounded by the physical manifestation of my family's hate. And I breathed. The constant noise in my head, the high-pitched, incessant whine of their needs, their expectations, their disappointments, their guilt, it was gone. The house stank of rot and decay, but the air, for the first time in my entire adult life, felt clear. I was standing in the wreckage of my past, and all I could feel was the profound, terrifying, absolute silence of my future. It was the sound of freedom. The first call I made was not to a contractor. It was to a biohazard remediation team. The deputy had given me the card, his eyes full of pity, calling them trauma cleaners. And the description felt chillingly accurate. I couldn't set foot in that house again as it was. I couldn't be the one to scrub the lipstick off the mirror or bleach the sour milk from the floorboards. That felt like a violation, like letting their final act of malice soak into my skin. So I paid a premium to have the infection removed. Mark and I stood on the sidewalk, a safe, sterile distance, and watched them go in. They were two men in white hazmat suits, their faces obscured by respirators. They looked like astronauts or men cleaning up a chemical spill, which I supposed was exactly what this was. They worked for 6 hours. They carried out 43 heavy-duty black contractor bags filled with the literal physical rot of my family's hate. When they were done, the lead cleaner, a man with weary eyes, signed the invoice. "It's sterile, ma'am," he said. "The air's clean, but you're still gonna want to paint." After they left, we walked inside. The house was a vast empty cavern. The stench of rot was gone, replaced by the overpowering astringent smell of industrial-strength bleach. It was clean, but it was also dead. And the cleaners in their efficiency had left one thing. They had cleaned the bathroom, but in my old bedroom, the message on the mirror remained. Ingrate! Perhaps I had in my daze told them to leave it. I couldn't remember. I stood in the empty room and stared at my own reflection fractured by the waxy blood-red letters. Mark didn't say, "I'll get it." He didn't try to shield me from it. He just walked back out to the car and returned with a plastic putty knife and a bottle of Goo Gone, the kind used for removing stubborn labels. He handed me the knife. "Together," he said. My hand was shaking as I put the blade to the glass. I scraped at the I, at the N, at the G. The red came off in thick, greasy, stubborn curls. It was like trying to scrape away a scar. It took an hour of scraping, spraying, and scrubbing, our arms aching until the last faint pink haze was gone. When it was done, I looked at the mirror. I saw my face pale, exhausted, and streaked with my own sweat. But it was my face, unmarked. "There you are," Mark whispered, kissing the side of my head. The next day, we returned not with cleaners but with paint. We bought 5-gallon buckets of a color called New Hope, a pale, clean, optimistic gray. We put on old clothes, cranked up a playlist on a portable speaker, and we went to war. We didn't talk. We just worked. The rhythmic shush of the rollers was a kind of meditation, a physical act of reclamation. We painted over the wall where Leo had punched a hole 2 years ago during a fight about his car. We painted over the faint water ring where my mother's favorite vase had sat. We painted over the ghosts. Every stroke felt like I was covering the past, burying their presence under a layer of my own choosing. By the end of the weekend, the house was no longer a tomb. It was just a house, an empty, gray, quiet house. It was a blank slate. We were sitting on the front porch drinking cheap cold beer out of the bottle, our clothes and hair speckled with paint, when a car pulled up to the curb. My entire body went rigid, a jolt of pure Pavlovian panic. I was ready for another fight, another confrontation. But the person who got out was not Aunt Carol. It was Mrs. Davies, my old Sunday school teacher, the woman who had publicly shamed me in the post office, her eyes full of pity for my poor mother. I stood up slowly, my fists clenching at my sides. Mark stood with me. She walked up the path not with the confidence of a righteous woman, but with the hesitant, shuffling gait of someone in shame. She stopped at the bottom of the steps, twisting her hands together. "Hailey," she said, and her voice was thin. I'm here to apologize." I said nothing. I just stared, my heart a cold, hard stone. "I heard, dear," she said, her voice dropping, her eyes filling with tears. "But they weren't the crocodile tears of my mother. They were real. My son-in-law, he's Deputy Miller. He was the one who escorted you. He came home that night and he told my daughter what he saw in this house. What they did." She took a gasping breath as if the words themselves were painful. "And then I ran into Arthur Dunn's wife at the book club, and she told me. She told me about the lawsuit, about the binder, about the numbers." Her face crumpled and she took a step closer, looking up at me, a woman begging for an absolution I didn't know how to give. "Oh, Hailey, child, what we did, what I did. We were so wrong. She's been telling that poor widow story for a decade, and we let her. We never questioned it, and we let her do this to you. We abandoned you." She was openly weeping now. "What I said to you at the post office, it was cruel. It was gossip. It was a sin, and I am so, so deeply sorry." I hadn't realized I was crying until Mark's thumb gently wiped a tear from my cheek. I couldn't speak. I just nodded, a single, jerking motion. The apology didn't fix anything, but it was like a bone, long dislocated, snapping back into place. An agonizing, necessary relief. She went back to her car and returned with a tinfoil-covered casserole dish. "It's just lasagna," she whispered. but it's hot. That night, another neighbor, a man I'd only ever waved to, came by with a six-pack. "Heard you were painting," he said gruffly. "That mother of yours. She was always a piece of work. Glad to see you're taking the house back." It was a slow, quiet sea change. The truth, once it finally broke the surface, was a powerful, solid thing. I had lost the family I was born into. But I was in the most painful and unexpected way gaining a community that chose to see the truth. The last room was the attic. It was dusty and hot, filled with things they hadn't bothered to take or destroy. Mostly my old things, my old life. But in the corner, I found a damp cardboard box, the flaps half open. It was labeled in my mother's looping script, "Dad's office." My heart stopped. She had left it. Just left it. Probably couldn't sell any of it, a new cynical part of my brain noted. I knelt on the dusty floorboards. It was mostly junk. Old tax returns from the 90s, dried up pens, a broken adding machine. I was about to tape it up and haul it to the dumpster with the rest of the ghosts, but something at the very bottom caught my eye. It was a small black leather-bound journal, the kind you buy at a stationery store, my father's. I never knew he kept one. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely pick it up. I opened it. It was mostly just him. Notes about the weather, observations about a fishing trip, complaints about his boss. It was so normal, so mundane, it made me ache. I flipped toward the end, past a note about my high school graduation, past a doodle of a fish. The entries became sparser. And then I found the last one. It was dated 1 month before the accident. The handwriting was different. It wasn't calm. It was a jagged, angry, terrified scrawl that dug into the paper. "Karen's spending is out of control again." I read the words a whisper in the silent, hot attic. "Another credit card maxed." I found the statement hidden under the mattress. She doesn't see it. Or she won't. I'm so worried for Hailey. She's the strong one. She's the one who sees. And I'm terrified. I am so terrified Karen will lean on her until she breaks. She's just a kid. She shouldn't have to carry this. She shouldn't have to carry us. I have to find a way to protect her. I have to. The entry just stopped. He never got to finish the thought. He never got to protect me. But he knew. I closed the journal and pressed it to my chest, a dry, racking sob tearing out of me, a sound that was more like a wounded animal than a person. He hadn't been a ghost to be used as a weapon against me. He had been my first ally, and I had been his last. The validation was a physical, crushing, overwhelming wave. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't the villain. I was just the daughter he had tried and failed to save. He saw it all. He knew. 6 months later, I stood in a cloud of sawdust, the air sharp with the scent of fresh-cut pine and new beginnings. The house on Maple Drive was gone. I'd sold it fast to a young couple who saw only the new paint and the clean floors, who had no idea of the ghosts they were displacing. I didn't care that I took a small loss. It wasn't an investment. It was an exorcism, and I had been willing to pay to have it finished. The profits, every last cent, were poured into this. Our future. The little fixer-upper in Chesterton, 2 hours away from that graveyard of a town, was no longer just a dream. It was a skeleton of 2x4s and plywood, a beautiful stark frame against a cold, clear November sky. The roof was on and the windows were in, but the walls were still open, revealing all the wiring, all the plumbing. The bones of the thing. There was an honesty to it that I loved. Mark was on a ladder, his tool belt slung low on his hips, securing a new beam. We'd been working on it ourselves every weekend. After the lawyers and the eviction and the cleaning, this was a different kind of exhaustion. This was a good exhaustion. This was the ache of building, not the trauma of demolishing. I still had the journal, my father's journal. I kept it on my new nightstand in my new apartment. I didn't read it every day, but I didn't need to. The words had done their work. For 10 years, my mother had weaponized his memory, turning him into a silent, disappointed ghost. whose only wish was for me to martyr myself on the family altar. She had used his love for me as the very leash she used to control me. But his own words in his own jagged, worried script had been the key. He hadn't been a ghost. He had been a prophet. He had seen the sickness in my mother, the parasitic nature of their need, and his last desperate thought had been to protect me from it. Reading that journal wasn't just validation, it was liberation. It was a blessing from the only man whose opinion they ever tried to hold over me. He wouldn't have been ashamed of me for walking away. He would have been horrified that I'd stayed so long. His memory was no longer a chain. It was a compass, and it had pointed me here to this new, unfinished life, to this man on a ladder, to this cold, clear air. I was finally free to be happy, not just in spite of them, but as a final victorious act of honoring the father they had tried to twist. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my work jacket. I tensed a small residual reflex, the ghost of an electric shock, but it wasn't the full-body panic of before. It was just a flicker. I pulled it out. An unknown number. A text message. My thumb steady opened it. The message was short, just 3 small, devastating sentences. I got a job, I'm paying my own rent, I'm sorry. It was Leo. I read the words. I read them again. A year ago, this text would have destroyed me. It would have been a flood of relief, of guilt, of immediate desperate hope. I would have called him crying. I would have offered money. I would have said, I'm so proud of you. I would have invited him for Thanksgiving. I would have, in my desperate need to have a brother, ignored the fact that he had stood by and watched our mother try to legally and emotionally annihilate me. I would have seen those 3 sentences as a door back into my old life. But I wasn't that person anymore. I stood there, the sound of Mark's nail gun popping in the background, and I felt a profound, distant, clinical sadness. I felt a quiet grief, not for the brother who was texting me, but for the little boy he used to be, the one who was now well and truly gone. I was genuinely glad he had a job. I was genuinely glad he was paying his rent. That was good. That was growth. But his apology, I realized, had nothing to do with me. It wasn't for me. It was for him. It was the final desperate attempt to fix it, to get that last bit of absolution from the person he had wronged so that he could feel better. It was in its own way just as selfish as everything else. I thought about replying. I thought about all the things I could say. Thank you for the apology. I'm glad you're doing well. Don't contact me again. But I realized that any reply at all, was a form of payment. It was giving him what he wanted, a reaction, an acknowledgement, a way back in, even if it was just a crack in the door. Forgiveness is a complex thing, a journey I might one day take for my own sake. But peace is a simple thing. It is a locked door, and my peace was no longer negotiable. I didn't delete the message. I didn't block his number. I just put the phone back in my pocket. I turned it off. I let the message and the sender and the entire burning wreckage of my past sit unanswered in the dark. Hey, you good? Mark called down. He was wiping his brow with his forearm, leaving a smudge of sawdust on his face. You look like you just saw a ghost. I looked up at him, at this good, solid man, this builder of things. I looked at the skeleton of our home, at the frame of my new life. I walked over to the makeshift table where we had the blueprints unrolled, weighted down by a coffee thermos and a tape measure. I picked up the red pen we were using to mark changes. I'm good, I said, and my voice was steady. It was my own. I'm great. I leaned over the plans, my eyes finding the small square room that was designated as office. With a firm, steady hand, I drew a new, bigger set of lines on the blueprint right where a solid wall was supposed to be. I was just thinking. I said, the red ink, a bright, clean line on the paper. I want to change this. I want a bigger window in here. I want more light. Mark grinned down at me. More light? We can do that. He started climbing down the ladder. I looked back at the blueprints, at the lines I had drawn myself. I was no longer a resource to be drained. I was no longer a safety net for people who chose to fall. I was the architect. And for the first time in my entire life, I was building a house where I was finally completely free to live. With the blueprint for her future finally in her own hands, Hailey's long chapter of silent service was finally closed. What did you think of her final choice with Leo? We read every single one of your thoughts, so leave a comment below. Be sure to subscribe for more. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.